Hi there, and welcome to Peninsula Players Presents. And Audie, hi again.
Hi, Greg.
Hi. So we're going to continue on with Peninsula Players history. And before we pick up from where we left off last time, I just wanted to say, and Audie, I know you agree with me that the people that were involved in these, especially in these early years of the theater, were incredibly committed, both to their work and to bringing high quality entertainment to Door County. And I find that really, really wonderful. The level of commitment and the love they had for doing it.
Exactly. And it's really the foundation of the organization of what Peninsula Players became. Is this is the bedrock of what the next 80 years are built upon. And I
Hmm.
think it's important to understand that diversity that they had, the commitment that they had, and their drive and passion wasn't to be famous, but to do good quality art.
Indeed, and I feel very fortunate in that in my time with the players overlapped with some people who we hope to talk to later who were around actually in the 40s to chat about what that was like, and I love feeling that connection, that arc of history. It's
It
very
is.
real.
And a company, a theater company is its people. So to know that drive and to see those little connections, I think just brings a spirit to, to
Yeah.
the organization.
So let's jump into it.
Okay.
When last we left you, it was the end of 1941. And just to remind you, at the end of 41, Great Britain and the United States declared war on Japan on December 8th, right after Pearl Harbor on December 7th. And then on December 11th, Britain and the United States declared war on Germany and Italy. And that's where we are in the world. And also to remind you, as we had mentioned before, that the draft had started in July of 1941. So all of that was going on around Door County and the world. So in 1942, I'd like to pick up with where the Fisher family was. Fishers being Caroline and Richard, the co-founders of the theater, their sister Margot, and their parents, Mama and or Lydia and C.R. Fisher. So Caroline is in Canada, right?
She's in Canada because Rhodian is somewhere there, and being in the military, they don't always exactly tell you where they are. So she always says in the wilds of Canada, spending time with Rhodian in her comments to the press.
But I
And
thought you had mentioned that you thought he might have been on Prince Edward Island, and
at
he
one
was.
point, yeah, towards the summer, he becomes an instructor. He becomes a flight instructor towards on Prince Edward Island, and that's where Caroline goes back to midsummer.
Just and to remind people that Rodian was a British citizen, so he enlisted in the Canadian Air Force, and then Caroline returns to Fish Creek on the week of April 22nd.
On that week of April 22nd, and announces that she's not sure how, if they're going to do a season or what shows they're going to do. So she's kind of undecided. And at that time as well, Margot is still in California, and Richard is looking at enlisting in the Navy. And Mama and Papa are either in Chicago or California themselves. And then Caroline, I think, goes from Door County to Chicago, and then eventually Mama comes back to Fish Creek to as well. So they're kind of in cross paths. But
And
Caroline
mind you,
doesn't come back to when she goes to Chicago, she comes back with a little friend.
so one of the reasons Caroline came back from Canada and Rodian was not only for the theater, but she was pregnant.
She was going to have a baby,
Yeah.
and yes, and so in mid-May, around the 18th, she gave birth in Chicago and was attended by their friend, Dr. Bookbinder. So,
The bookbinders having their summer home right next to Peninsula Players Theatre property.
yes. And so she's got this little bundle. So there's some things up in the air. Their mama tells the press too that they're having trouble finding male actors because of commitments. Leo Lucker has enlisted in the Army, but he hasn't been called up yet. And Leo
Mhm.
is their leading man and Richard Fisher's assistant. So he helps direct and put together the apprentices and performs in quite a few of the shows as well. So, Leo's accessibility is becoming limited. Richard's is in question, and Caroline is a new mom.
So, at this time, going into the 1942 possible season, it reminds me a lot of what's going on right now. There are so many unknowns.
There
We've got the war
are
going on. Men are not available
not
generally.
available. And also in May at this time, ration books become part of the American culture. So after Pearl Harbor, um, the United States government started limiting tires, the accessibility of somebody to purchase tires. And as the war progressed, ration books became a necessity. So they were really limiting what was available to people, from sugar to coffee and gasoline and then automobiles. So only people who needed to provide services like doctors or nurses or fire or police. So just people with transportation and services and goods was becoming very limited. And so to try to run a company and produce theater was becoming a challenge.
A real challenge,
A
not
real
just in
challenge.
getting personnel, but whether audience would come
Correct. Right.
because of the nature of the
Right.
country at
And
that
I
time.
also learned that there was a national speed limit that was passed at this time,
Oh,
and
really?
it was to 35 miles per hour.
Wow.
So trying to travel by car somewhere only at 35 miles per hour.
Why, to get from, say, Chicago to Door County then would have taken a while.
Taken a little bit longer than it used to. So
So we have her daughter, Caroline daughter, Heloise, is born on May 19th. And then I believe Caroline goes back to Door County in June.
she does, and I think Margot arrives, and Leo's not yet in the army, and he's expected to arrive in mid July, and Richard is not hasn't yet been called up either. So they're hanging around,
And
and
you think you know this because there's
because
a garden party.
there is, I found an article in the Chicago Tribune that a Mrs. W.H. Ryan
Mm.
hosted a garden party, and that Richard, Caroline, Margot, and Leo did a little entertainment for the guests. I don't know what they did, but they did a little entertainment.
Well, they had a lot of things up their sleeve.
They did. And at this garden party, it mentions how viewing a flood-lighted garden has taken a new significance for those art association members who are active in planning their flower show.
Which is
And
coming up.
which is
Uh,
coming up. So even though Peninsula Players didn't present any theater that summer, Richard and Caroline opened up the grounds and allowed their theatrical lighting to be used for a flower show on the grounds and on the stage of Peninsula Players Theater.
which was
So
an annual thing in Door
it,
County.
it was, and I think it's part of the touring of homes that some of the other organizations now do, and touring of gardens. This one was displayed on the players' property, so there were displays set up not only on the stage, but in what we affectionately call the far garden. So on the opposite side of the concession stand is a garden that has been set up, and there used to be a wading pond in there and a wishing pond, and there's another staircase that comes down. Well, there were displays set up in there, and one of the winning displays was a little grotto that was set up in one of the corners with cedar boughs and a statue of a Madonna and child with a candle in front of it. So
Hmm.
that was one of the ribbon winners. But one of the other things that was appealing was that Richard was using the theatrical lighting to light, and this was to be an evening event as well. So, what patrons have come to love and cherish about the romantic mood lighting of Peninsula Players Garden, I like to think that was a real kickoff point for Richard. That's where this kind of started as well.
And we've certainly kept that up.
Yes, and it's so beautifully. It was especially last summer when all of it was revamped and LED lights were put in. It's beautiful. It's magical. It's an
It
enchanting
is.
environment.
And that the annual Peninsula Flower Show was sponsored by the Peninsula Arts Association.
Yes, which also started in 1937. So the Peninsula Arts Association and Peninsula Players were very closely working together to bring cultural events. And so that was the organization that helped bring in the symphony the year before and the Russian trio as
Hmm.
well. So they were really close in bringing those classic arts to Dark County.
So as it turns out, the flower show was actually pretty much the only event that happened at the theater. The summer of 42, they decide that it's not possible to do any shows,
Right?
and then they disperse again.
They do, and that at that point, then Richard and Leo are both called into service. So they are now off doing their basic training and so forth. And um,
Caroline goes back to Canada.
Caroline goes back to Canada, and Margot is out in California with her husband. So
So after what was hopefully going to be a 42 season, they disperse, and the war, of course, is still continuing on. And we end up going to 1943, and the theater is just closed.
it is. It's closed because of the situation that's going on. Sturgeon Bay, in and of itself, with its shipbuilding history, has become very active and with producing equipment for the military. And my understanding here, if I get my notes correctly, because I want to make sure. So Latham Smith Shipbuilders provided 93 ships during the entire World War production. So
Mm.
90, and within their multiple locations of shipbuilding, they had a couple different locations, but one of them was in Door County. But between 1941 and 1945, the USA built almost 6,000 ships. And so, but 93 of them possibly, out of
And
the
there
Latham
was a connection between Peninsula Players Theater and Latham Shipbuilding.
and shipbuilding, which is why I mention it, is because then Latham Smith, who was the son, they've been building ships since World War One. So it's a long history of family. Well, Latham is worked with the Peninsula Arts Association and Peninsula Players to bring back the Russian trio for a benefit for the Russian aid. So there is
Because
a concert.
he's the chairman of the Door County Russian Relief Committee, right?
Correct.
Right.
Yes. So they get that those three kind of form a connection to, because of the transportation limitations and the rationing, the majority of the population is in Sturgeon Bay. So they bring the Russian trio in to perform in the Sturgeon Bay Auditorium, and those in uniform are admitted for free. So it's a cultural event for those working in the area.
And just to remind people, the Russian Trio was a classical group with musicians that worked mostly with the Chicago Symphony.
Mm-hmm. Correct. Very talented musicians.
Very, very talented. So that was very nice. They raised money for that organization.
Yes. And at that time, Richard was supposedly stationed in the Caribbean. So he was doing things, encouraging people remotely.
And he
And
was
partnering
in the
and
Navy.
in the Navy, and they were working with their local Jane Bookbinder. So again, the Bookbinder family,
Hmm.
important connection to the Fisher family.
So again, that was pretty much the only event in 43 in which
Mm-hmm.
the players was involved. And then, of course, we go through the rest of 43 into 44, and the
Mm-hmm.
war continues both in Europe and in the Pacific. And in 44, again, the theaters are closed, and this year there are no events whatsoever.
Correct. Yep. It's Mama and Papa are there just looking after the property, just kind
Hmm.
of taking care of things.
Hmm. And then, so it's interesting to go through what some of the Peninsula Players people did during the war. We
Right.
know that Rodin and Caroline were mostly in Canada, and I think they had another little present.
They had another little present. Yes, when Caroline comes back after the war, she now comes with two daughters. So she comes with Eloise and Dunya. So,
And Richard has, as you mentioned, he was in the Caribbean, and then he ended up being stationed in the Pacific as a lieutenant,
as
right?
a lieutenant, right? He when he is discharged, he's at the lieutenant, and Leo is also in the Army Air Corps, which becomes the Air Force eventually, but it's the Army Air Corps, and he's stationed in Iceland. And Bob Thompson is also in the Army Air Corps, flying, as well as Wuthering
Richard
Heights.
Angarola.
Yes, as well. And he was a very active pilot. He flew like 56 missions, including on D-Day, um,
In Europe.
in Europe. Yes, and it wasn't just the men who were in the service. It was also the ladies. Helen Casey Bragdon joined the WACS, and she was the local press representative. So using her skills, she was a graduate of Smith College, and using her talent as a writer and her presence of being comfortable in front of people, she was the local press representative, I believe, in New Guinea and Australia and a few other locations that she was assigned to, and
Mostly in the Pacific.
mostly in the, yes. And so just the, the strength of this the generation, which you always say, but uh,
Yes, the Great Generation,
it
yeah.
was, yes. And so they're out there, having these different experiences and getting
And
through.
also Jean Sincere, one of the actresses,
Yeah,
was.
she was touring with the USO, so she was all over Europe as well, entertaining the troops, and it's just fascinating. It is. I always say that
So,
often, but it is to me. It's fascinating.
so there wasn't any theater going on per se, but people were busy and there was a lot to
A
deal with.
lot. Yes.
And
Yes.
then we get into 1945. Of course, that was a very big year for lots of
Mhm.
reasons, but on May 7th, Germany capitulated, and May 8th, the next day, was VE Day, Victory in
Mhm.
Europe Day. And then, so that ended the war in Europe. And then Hiroshima was bombed on August 6th, and Nagasaki on August 9th, and Japan surrendered August 14th, which ended World War II, and life started happening again in this country and with the players.
Correct. And Caroline, at that point, I think, had been visiting her parents on the property at Peninsula Players, and she was with her two daughters, so she had them there. And it was that week of like August 14th, 15th, the Door County Advocate had they had spoken, and Caroline was quoted to say, "We have been up here almost all summer, and I just can't stand it any longer without giving a play."
So, what did she do?
So they, because what they closed the last season and their last performance was Wuthering Heights, they still had, a stock company retains their costumes and their sets. And because the weather wasn't as promising as they had hoped for that closing, they remount Wuthering Heights for another weekend. So they bring
And also, Richard Angarola, because
Busy
the war
there.
in Europe was over, he was available.
He was available, and the radio actor who was in Chicago, Wilms, was still in Chicago, so he was going to come up to do it. Caroline was available.
I
Another,
think they wrote him out of the radio show,
they
right?
wrote him out of the radio show that he was starring in just so he could come up and do this weekend performance. And another member of the company wasn't available, but this is when Papa Fisher makes his Peninsula Players debut under a pseudonym of see Rayborn Fife, and this biography of him performing in Ireland is made up. So that Fisher family, they had a sense of humor.
I wonder how willingly Papa Fisher did this.
So
So,
he's thrown into the cast as well.
right.
And
So they did this the weekend, August 31st and September 1st to 3rd. And how did that go?
it again, they had some issues with the weather, and but they were together to be happy to be together from all over. So, people came from all across the country back to Door County, and they felt really great. And even Richard was saying he was happy to be back at a theater he felt that was his home. So even after touring World War II and being everywhere else, he was just happy to be back.
And they were excited to be back doing what they love to do,
Yep.
which is actually where we are
Right.
in the world right
Exactly.
now.
We're waiting for that.
Yes. So they finished Wuthering Heights and that foreshortened season, and they start prepping for 1946 and a full season.
And a full season right away. And Leo is helping with that as well. And both, I think he and Richard might be in New York at this point, and Caroline is still in Canada with Rodian, and Margot is out in California. So they have this East Coast, West Coast um, connection. And so a lot of the talent that they're even looking at comes from those different coasts to the center of the country at Peninsula Players for the 1947, no, six, we're on six,
46.
1946.
And going into the 46th season, a lot of stuff happened before the season actually started, including they were recruiting student apprentices.
They were recruiting student apprentices into the program. So the Wharf Theater is not in existence anymore. They're
It
actually
was the
recruiting
small 50-seat theater connected to the boathouse.
the boathouse. They incorporate them more into juvenile parts or smaller parts within the company itself. So they become part of the core company, but their daytime duties are also still to help build the scenery, work in the box office, ushering, and those
And
activities.
then Richard Fisher had a bunch of landscaping projects that
Yes,
included a local
yes.
person.
And he also had the assistance of a neighbor in Juddville. So Henry Klingbeil, who was in his 70s, was given kudos for helping to expand the stone staircase. So in a previous episode, we talked about the stone staircase that was part of the boys' camp that led from the upper parking lot down to the audience level. And Henry had refurbished some of that. He expanded the bottom terrace portion so that it was a wider uh, landscape, a stepstone for people to enter. So if you attended the theater in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, that broad stone staircase entrance terrace area, that's what was incorporated at that time. And he also had done other stonework across the property, including the terrace down by the shoreline. And
And
expanding that.
they added a flower border in the.
In, correct, and potted flower borders of geraniums and petunias alongside of the theater. And the biggest improvement, because of all of the weather problems and cancellations that they've had over the past few years, I think in coordination too and getting to know Latham Smith, one of the engineers and architects at Latham Smith engineered a canopy for Peninsula Players, and they put in a tent-like canopy to go over the audience when there'd be bad weather. and, and it was rigged like a ship so that it could be pulled and drawn over the audience rather quickly and then stored above it. So they had an I-beam above and attached to the stage house. And then there were cement-like blocks that were used to connect the tent-like two in the back. And I know you and I, Greg, sometimes would trip over them or see them
Yes.
still on the hill slope because they were still there.
They were there until the new theater was built.
Yes.
Yeah.
But
And
they,
so it was an engineer for a shipbuilding company and a chief rigger who put helped.
And a chief rigger. I know I'm trying to find my notes because I wanted to mention their names and
Well,
right now.
Chris
Oh, here it is.
Strick
Yes.
was the chief rigger, and R.A. Stern was
R.A.
the
Stern, yes.
engineer.
And he had just joined Latham Smith shipbuilding company right after World War II. So this was one of his first, community projects that he was assigned. But what
And
was kind of sad, um, in the same article that mentions that all these improvements are going on at Peninsula Players and that the canopy is going on, was also the same time frame that Latham Smith had unfortunately lost his life in a boating accident. So I got to read the exciting news at the theater and discovered the tragedy of his loss as well.
he was out in a sailboat, is that?
He was out in his sailboat and with a couple of his executive co-workers at the lodge and his daughter and her college roommate, and a squall, just a 2-minute storm came up and capsized their boat to the Half Moon. And that time period, the entire maritime community was out searching and looking for survivors. And unfortunately, only his daughter Patsy survived. She swam to shore.
Hmm. And we all are well aware of the waters around Door County can be very dangerous very quickly.
Yes.
But the good news was that we now had a canopy
Yes.
over the Peninsula Players Theatre audience, and and over the years we've heard lots of stories about that and I just got an email from a friend of the theater who talked about. She said. When I was there was still a tarp over the audience. At times, I was one of those who held it up in the back of the theater so that the weight of the water wouldn't tear it. Oh, what fun, and lots to laugh about, too.
I think that's one of the things I love the most about being a house manager at the theater is meeting all of these patrons who've been there for generations and hearing their stories. And just like that one, or when they would drive up, it's like, oh no, I had to get on my motorcycle and just drive up and see the show, and then I drive back afterwards. Or picking up a tent thing just like that to hold up the canopy to keep it from the water from sagging in. So.
That wouldn't be a good thing.
And then I also remember Maggie Magerstadt as a performer saying people always knew if you trained at Peninsula Players because you had to vocalize over the storms and over all of that. So it's like they knew people had performed there because they could be heard in the back of the house.
Yes, exactly. And we're so lucky in the new theater that we can bring the panels in and have microphones.
Yes.
But yeah, back then you had to be a sturdy person. So with all of this stuff, and I think the parking area also was enlarged and leveled.
Yes, they've a little enlarged and leveled, and potholes filled in, and everything. And the ticket booth was up in the upper parking lot for the box office. And they also planned a very active performance season. And we're trying, not to do so much experimental or classical theater, but maybe some things that were a little more contemporary appeal in a celebration of returning to the stage. But they still had, like, the stories were still credible. They were very artistic stories.
Yes, and there ended up being 10 shows altogether.
And they were very ambitious in what they chose to do, including a show that had children performers. So they had hired a young man of 9 years old to come perform in one of the shows that year that was based off of a show that was running on Broadway.
And Alan Nelson was his name, right?
Alan, and he had been touring in a production called Life with Father. So it just made me think of when we did Over the Tavern and had all of those nice young Isaiah and Zach and everybody on property, just have those fresh faces around.
And so the season opened again on July 4th.
On July 4th, and they reopened with The Man Who Came to Dinner, another production that had complications with weather and got
Before,
rained out
yes.
before. And so they were excited to be able to bring that performance back to audiences who maybe didn't get to see it all the way through the first time.
Right.
And they still had their diverse seasons. So they had comedies and a mystery with Criminal at Large.
Which was
And
the second show.
was the second show, and of course, another personal appearances. And the juvenile feature was Kiss and Tell, about two teenage girls getting romantically interested in boys.
I
And,
see.
and then we were back to our double billing. So Salome was always a draw, so they did that along with putting in front of it with their double billing, The Happy Journey by Thornton Wilder.
Mm-hmm.
And then kind of came the highlights. So Caroline wasn't in any show that year except for the next one, Angel Street. And so she was in Angel Street. And then alumni returned from Hollywood. They actually flew in from California to be there. And David Bruce came in to do Private Lives. And he had filmed over the course of the war. He was in the Navy for a while until he developed chronic ear infections, and then he was discharged. So he had done almost 20 films during the war years, and
Mm-hmm.
he comes back and it's a highlight. It's a big deal in Door County for
But
that.
before, around August
Oh, that's right. Yes.
7th, there was a big thing in Milwaukee called.
The Milwaukee Centrum. So the city of Milwaukee was celebrating its 100th anniversary in 1946. And they were throwing a huge event along the lake shore. It was going to be like a 4-week event, and they invited communities from across the state to participate. And they built a stage. They spent $75,000 in
Mm,
1946 to build this stage and to present events. So there were evening events. There were just a big celebration for the city and for the state.
and I think that it was called Centurama.
Centurama.
Yeah.
And yes. And oh no, I gotta find it. So
And then I think Richard Fisher wrote a little show for it.
he did. And again, it was Latham Smith who said, oh yeah, Richard would be good for that. So there was that connection there as well. With them. And so Richard volunteered to write the script, and they were also participating in a parade, and there'd be fireworks, and they also had national theater acts coming in. So there were different things performing those evenings. And Richard wrote a script, and on August 7th, they got into a car and a bus provided by the city of Sturgeon Bay and drove down to perform Love Among the Orchards, about Milwaukee tourists visiting and falling in love in Door County.
I see.
And I wish I could read it. I don't know where or what it was, but that was going on as well. So being a community partner, um, they participated in that.
And
And
Richard certainly wore a lot of hats.
he did, and they had musical effects during it, because I remember reading that Helen Casey Bragdon and Marianne Collins were running the sound effects and music for the production. So
At the Centurama.
at the Centurama in Milwaukee.
But that was just a 1 day thing, right?
That for them it was a 1 day thing, but the event, the Centurama itself, was like 3 to 4 weeks long, because they
Wow.
had different communities coming in. So Bayfield, Ashland and Bayfield up in the northern part of the state, and Waukesha had its own day. So like each community had its own day that they had performances. They had a parade. They had a queen. So each community could put a queen in the parade,
I see.
and a float. And Door County sent a float, and they had models on the sides depicting the winter events and summer events. And it was a big deal for the area.
Yeah, quite so. So then they continue with the season. Then I think you mentioned, then after that they did Angel Street with Caroline.
Yes. And then David Bruce came in to do
Private Life.
Private Lives, and then Julie Bishop, who was Jacqueline Wells. Again, these people just switch their names around. So Julie Bishop returns, and she's scheduled to be in the Philadelphia story and Laura, the stage adaptation of Laura.
Mm-hmm.
And so they do the Philadelphia story.
And Julie Bishop had been busy during the war years too with films.
Yeah, exactly. A dozen or more films that she had made films with Humphrey Bogart, John Wayne, Errol Flynn, and several other. Yeah, and so it yes. But Hollywood calls her back, so she has to leave early. So they
she did the Philadelphia story, but
she couldn't complete and rehearse for Laura. So instead, what they decide to do, since Helen is there and Leo is there, they bring back Night Must Fall
by Emlyn Williams.
Yeah.
Which is a scary story.
So that's what they end the season with for 46 is that. So.
And so it sounds like they did okay.
They did, and people were anxious, back in Door County, and anxious to see them, and happy. So, mm-hmm. And so they continue with their plans. And after the season, I believe Richard and Leo go to New York, and that's now where Leo becomes active in the American Theater Guild, and he starts looking for apprentices for the next season. So he starts screening and looking for applicants. At that point, Margot returns to California, and Caroline, at some point we learn, is in Maine. There was
thought that her father.
Yeah, her father, I believe, grew up in Maine, and their parents met in New York, and then if Rodian's still in Canada, part of that. So, but she's around. So she had received this letter from Sam Wanamaker. So Sam Wanamaker had also been in the Army, but he's making his Broadway debut right now with Ingrid Bergman. So
wow.
So after the service, that's going on, and other company members are, picking up their careers again. Stacy Keach is now a talent scout for RKO, and another company member from the 1935 company is also been in some films, Kevin O'Shea, as well as working on Broadway.
So Peninsula Players company members from the beginning and the current time are getting back to work, and the country's getting back to normal.
Yes, and they're starting to plan for 1947.
And so that's where we'll end it today. We'll come back to 1947 and just finished going through some eventful years.
Yes.
Not just for the world, but for the theater. And it seems like the theater with the canopy, etc., is going into a new era.
Yes. Yes, they're continuing to expand.
Well, thanks again, Audie.
Thank you, Greg. Good to see you.
For all of those facts in your head.
They gotta come out.
Yeah. and we'll be back and continue on with the history next time. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you then.